Good day, friends, and welcome back to our study on the Psalms. Another week of lockdown behind us, and another week ahead of opportunities to grow in God. It would be far better for me if we were all in a room together working this out as a group, but we'll do the best we can in the meantime. Just this last week, I was looking at the walls inside our house, noticing the need for new paint and wondering, here we are jammed in lockdown, and what can I do to resolve this situation? And then discovering, which I hadn't noticed before, I had 20 liters of the exact paint I needed stashed away in one of our stores, and there I had everything I needed. And in a way, the Psalms can be like that for us, that we go through life wondering, how am I going to handle this? What can I do here? Where will I find what I need? But sometimes locked away is the resources we need. And so this video is both one to give you an appetite to climb into the Psalms regularly, that it becomes an opened resource for you, and also that you just grow in your understanding and connection in the church over such matters. Okay, and so today we're going to go into more of a practical session, which will continue next week, which is the final of our 3 sessions on Psalms. And what we're going to do is apply the things that we went through last week into looking at various Psalms, and along the way there'll be opportunities for your exercises to do, and I'll leave you at the end with some things you can chase in the week ahead. And so last week was a bit intense. It won't be as intense today, but that foundation is something we always bear in mind, and I hope you'll be delightfully surprised how much we'll make use of it. Okay, so let's get into matters for today. So first up, I've chosen Psalm 18, something I want to go through, and I would encourage you to get your favorite Bible translation. If you have more than one, then get 1 or 2 others, or if you're really up for it, you can get even more. But if you only got the one, that's also perfectly fine. And page away to Psalm 18, and we're going to look into it. But first of all, above all things, is just to take a moment to pray. So pause the video now, that we can approach this prayerfully, with a listening ear and humbly and seeking to learn. And then we'll carry on after that. So the first thing I want to look at Psalm 18 is its context, particularly its historical context. It's a psalm that has got a lot of history attached to it. And just here at the beginning, in the introduction, it says in my Bible, "For the director of music of David, the servant of the Lord, he sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul." So that immediately puts it into a historical context that we can look at. And from there, I just quickly took my cross-reference Bible, and I see at the top that the entire psalm is reproduced in 2 Samuel 22, and that is very interesting that it would be reproduced in entirety like that. So there's 2 issues with context I just want to look into. Let's begin with the 2 Samuel 22 link. So 2 Samuel is the narrative account of David's rule, initially as king of Judah after Saul died, and then after some years becoming king of the entire nation of Israel. And the climax of it is the moment of covenant that God has with him, and then thereafter into the length of his rule that towards the end seems to have more downs than ups. But the narrative ends at the end of chapter 20. And chapter 21 to the end of 2 Samuel is not part of the chronological story of David. It's more like a series of appendices, important summaries or moments that have been placed there for their priority. And one of these is Psalm 18, recorded in chapter 22. So there's 6 stories that are mentioned in these appendices. The first and the last have got to do with making right, so that God may bless Israel. In chapter 21, we got David facilitating vengeance for the Gibeonites on the house of Saul, and right at the end of 2 Samuel, we've got David making right for the sinful census that he took that brought God's anger towards Israel. So that's 2 of them, and inside of that, the second story has got to do with David's mighty men and their warring against the giants of the Philistines, and that is the second and the fourth accounts. Obviously, David's mighty men, incredible group of warriors who were with David for all those years, and so he notes them there. In the middle are 2 songs, and it's Psalm 18 is one of them, and the other is David's last words. So you can see, put with these other 5, that Psalm 18 is a very important psalm, and it is a summary of God's help for David against all his enemies, where ultimately David came to a point of great victory. Returning to the intro at the beginning of Psalm 18, we can see then that David says this is a song he sang because God delivered him from the hands of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And this again gives us some historical context that you can look at, take your time to examine. David's conflicts with Saul begin in 1 Samuel chapter 18 and run all the way through to chapter 26 of 1 Samuel. And so there's material in there that you can look at. And then David's other conflicts with his other enemies, particularly the Philistines, you can find in 1 Samuel chapter 27 to 31. And then his final victories that established and solidified his kingship in Jerusalem over all Israel and his dominance over the surrounding nations, you can find in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and chapter 10. Quite nice to have that historical context to remember when reading through the Psalms. And it, as I said, Psalm 18 appears to be a summary psalm, a final reflection after David has achieved all his victories and he's at peace in Jerusalem, probably just after chapter 10 and before things start to go wrong and for him, and he just reflects on what God has done and his victories for him. So that historical context I got by looking at the intro of the psalm, by having a glance at my cross-references, and then by consulting my study Bible. It helped me with a bit of that background. Just as we look into the psalm itself, we see the first 2 verses again are kind of like a summary praise, and it is very nice to read. David says, "I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." Now you could just stop right there and just take each of those words, each of those descriptions that David gives of God, and you could hours and hours of reflection and study. So maybe it's an exercise that you want to consider. In those first 2 verses, you can write down all the descriptions of what God is to David. Use your cross-references, use your Bible dictionary tools, look at your study Bible, what each of those words mean. If you have a Hebrew interlinear, you can go look at the meaning of those Hebrew words, and just enjoy David's revelation of who God is for him. But of course there is a whole lot more to the psalm, and if you read the rest of it, you come to understand why David describes God as he does, in such military terms, in such protection terms, in such strength and power terms as he does in verses 1 and 2. But look at the psalm as a whole. What is interesting for me, the first thing that strikes me when I look at it, the psalm begins with David experiencing the cords of death entangling him and the torrents of destruction overwhelming him. 2 very strong images, uncomfortable images of cords of death. Think of it around the neck, and these torrents of destruction. Have you ever been caught in the ocean where wave after wave is hitting you? You're just trying to breathe and find your footing, and you feel the power of this. And so very strong beginning where David was totally overcome and on his way to the grave. That's how it begins. But the psalm ends in verse 50 saying he gives his king great victories. He shows unfailing love to his anointed, to David and to his descendants forever. So it begins in total traumatic destruction moment, and but it ends with victory. And so that's something to take note of. And actually, if you look at the psalm, you realize there's a progression from that, from his near death through to this incredible victory. And let's take a quick look at that in a sweep. He begins by saying he's overcome, that he is got the cords of the grave coiled around him, the snares of death confronting him, and he cries out to God, and God is roused from his throne and comes in power and scatters David's enemies. And then not only does he end the threat to David, but he reaches down and lifts David up to a spacious place, to a happy place, and he is rescued. But doesn't end from there. The progression continues, because from there we see God begins to train David and to strengthen him and enable him. And then there's a further progression where it's David who's defeating his enemies. So it began with David overwhelmed by his enemies, basically destroyed by his enemies and ruined by his enemies, being rescued by God. But it ends off with David being the one who's defeating his enemies by the enabling and the training and the favor and the power of God. And it finishes with David saying, I've defeated them all, and God, you are great. So just to notice that progression in the psalm, from facing death to sitting in victory and praising God. Looking at that broad sweep of the psalm and that progression, and David's concluding reflections both at the beginning and at the end, it raises a question for me, that facing death, being overwhelmed, being overcome, not being able to defeat enemies or find success and victory, and maybe facing destruction and ruin, what does that signal in my life? Because in David's life, what that signaled was the mobilizing of God and his resources. Now, we might think that when we're facing the cords of death or the torrents of destruction or the snares and the cords of the grave, that obviously signals our final moments, and that we are now in deep, deep trouble and what can happen. But for David, it signals the mobilizing of God. And not just that God would come and scatter the enemies, not that he would end the trouble, but he would draw David to a spacious place, to a place of favor and joy. And not just that, but God would train David. And not just that, but God would then enable him to defeat his enemies. And so there's a real question here, that what do we do when we're faced with big trouble in our lives? And a related question is, what raw material does God need to make a success of our lives? Because you look at the situation where David was in now, there's very little potential, there's very little going for him. In fact, he just had torrents of destruction and cords of death. But God is able to do so much with what we think in our lives is so little. One tricky bit to the psalm that you might find quite disturbing as you read, or you might not sure what to do with, is from verse 20, where David explains in some verses about why he believes God has come to his rescue. And he says things like, "The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands he has rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, I am not guilty of turning from my God. All his laws are before me, I have not turned away from his decrees. I have been blameless before him, have kept myself from sin. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight." And so that's quite a thing now, because you might be questioning David. I mean, was that true of David's life? Was he righteous and blameless? I don't know. You can ask some questions. You can be quite disturbed by what he's saying here. You can also be disturbed in another way, to say, well, what chances do I have? What is my record like? I mean, will God ever rescue me? Am I blameless? Am I righteous? Have I kept all his ways? Where do I stand now? And so you might be quite disturbed by this, or unsettled, or not enjoying this part, or questioning. And this is a great part of the process with the Psalms, is wondering what to do with these kinds of things, and to question these things. And so just some thoughts from me in trying to deal with the unsettling elements of this is that, one is that this part of the psalm is prophetic, because David is truly not always blameless and righteous, but there is one who is, and that is Jesus. And that my rescue by God is bound up in God's relationship to Jesus. And there's something of Christ's righteousness which is applied to me, and Christ's blamelessness, and Christ's pure obedience, and his ability to walk this life properly, that has got meaning for me. So that's the one side, is this prophetic. But on the other side, trying to get some understanding of what David could mean is, although we are imperfect and we struggle, there's still the big decisions of where we stand. I'll give an example from Psalm 17. David makes this mention in verse 14. He says, "By your hand you saved me from such people, Lord, from those of this world whose reward is in this life." And so there is still, although we're imperfect and we struggle, there is still the idea of where do we stand? Are we the people of this world, or are we the people of God? And we can see throughout David's life and all the struggles, how he pressed into God, how he looked to God, how he trusted God, how he chose God, how he depended on God, how he limited himself according to the word of God. And so there was a definite application of following God and the truth of God. And even book 1 of Psalms, which is Psalm 1 to 41, most of them refer to David's period of conflict with Saul and with his enemies, maybe all those years in the desert, those times of struggle. And so there's over 30 psalms produced during days of conflict and struggle. That just shows that he applied himself to God, he leant on God, he pressed into God, he sought God in all those times, and he processed his struggles with God. And so, yeah, those might be two thoughts. But how would you deal with that? What do you make of this? How do you respond to these verses? So I believe we can have great confidence in the rescue of God towards us as we look to Christ to overcome our weaknesses, as we look to Christ to cover us, and as we step into his righteousness and to his life, and we seek more and more of him through the power of the Spirit, we can have great confidence for the work of God in our lives, as we see in this psalm. It also raises another interesting question on reflection, that what do we really want, and what does God want for us? Because we might be facing immense pressure and trouble and cry to God, and then he rescues us, and then we are relaxed now, we carry on until the next time we're in trouble, we cry out to God. But what does God want? God wants to train us, God wants to strengthen us, God wants to enable us, he wants to show us the weaponry he has for us, and he wants us to be folk that overcome, folk that can fight our way through trouble. And that is the investment that God wants to make in us. It's never a case of, thank you God, I'll take it from here. It's always in the power of God. But that is something perhaps for us to notice, that God is not just there to sort out our problems. He's keen to train us, that we could see victories in our lives. Maybe you've got other reflections, but you might want to write out that progression and look at it and see what God has done for David, remembering his history and his context and the severe pressure he was under from Saul and from his enemies. And this, the amazing transition that he went from 1 Samuel 18, those days of being nothing, having nothing, and being nowhere, through to sitting in Jerusalem on the throne. And that he just reflected on what God had done in those difficult days, the training, the transformation, the enabling, that God used all that terrible raw material to produce something amazing in David's life. What reflections do you have? Take some time, consider it. And where are you in your life right now? Are you feeling like you've got the cords of death around you? What would you do with that? Are you feeling that you've just been rescued, that you're in a spacious place now? Is that it? Does God have more? That you're in the place of training, that there's some things you could think about there. That you're in the place of victory and remembering to celebrate and to thank God. So this becomes something that we can pray for. If we discover ourselves under immense pressure, under torrents of opposition and struggle, that we can begin to pray and say, God, I need your intervention now. You can turn this around. I can't turn it around. I'm overcome. As he says in verse 17, God rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who are too strong for me. Saying, God, I can't do anything with the situation, but I know you can. And I'm asking you, I'm calling out to you, crying out to you for your rescue. That you bring me to spaciousness, that God, you'd begin to train me, that you'd begin to show me how to handle these battles, and that God, you would enable me to go towards victory. And at the end of it, Lord, I'll turn around and thank you and praise you and say, it's all because of you, my Lord whom I love, my salvation, my rock, my refuge, and so on. That's all I want to cover in Psalm 18 for this purpose, and it's just an amazing psalm to go through and to contemplate, again with that big question: if I've got overwhelming trouble in my life, what does it really signal? Does it say I'm finished, or does it signal the rescue of God? And it's again, I mentioned last week that the Psalms are not abstract truths. They're truth that is developed and expressed within human experience. And everything in this psalm doesn't come from David philosophizing or generating abstract ideas. It comes from him reflecting on the work of God in his life and his own story. And this is his celebration. As a parting exercise, maybe you'll enjoy doing this. Go through the psalm and looking at this progression from being overcome by destruction and having no future through to being seated in victory. Maybe you want to look at what is David's role in all of this, and what is God's role in all of this. For example, the beginning, David facing destruction, part of his role was to cry out to God. We know very well that we can go through trouble and struggle with not calling out to God at all. But we can see for this progression to happen, part of David's role was to call out to God. And then another example, God's role is to operate in power. When we are overcome, we are overcome. When the enemies are too powerful for us, they're too powerful for us. It's the power of God we need to rely on, and boy, does he come in power. He comes with such strength and awesome movement, and it's just with his own devastation. God is moved by our suffering, and so we can look to God to play his role. He is faithful, and he gets cross for us, and he rises, and he comes down in power to scatter the enemy. So why don't you do an exercise on that? Look at David's role and God's role. You can pause the video now if you want to do that, and then I'll just have a list of some of my thoughts on some of these things you can compare or add to, or you can examine your own reflections. in becoming king, the thing that preoccupied David the most, the thing that he was most obsessed with and needed to see happen, was that the glory of God would be resident in the city of Jerusalem. And so his first act is to bring the Ark of the Covenant out from west of the city in, and then to set up the tabernacle, the tent, and so that he would be living with the presence of God. And that was his major preoccupation, and he was so delighted to eventually get that right. And later on into his rule, when his son Absalom rebels against him and David has to flee from Jerusalem in order to survive the attack, the thing that breaks him is his separation from the presence of God. And Psalm 63 seems to be written in that time. David and his entourage, they flee from the city eastwards. They go over the Mount of Olives and into what's known as the desert or the wilderness of Judah, just south of Jericho, just west of the Dead Sea. It's a place that David knew well, and he writes Psalm 63 just longing for the presence of God. Have you ever felt far from God, just knowing that you had something more than before, not because of sin or because of something that's just some kind of circumstance has caused this? Psalm 63 is a beautiful one to express this longing. And so he begins here this saying, "You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there's no water." Now, if you look at that in the ESV, it talks about my soul. It says it 3 times. It says, "My soul thirsts for you." And then he remembers being worshipping in the sanctuary of God. And he talks about his soul being satisfied in the middle of the psalm and towards the end. He says, despite being away, his soul clings to him. And looking around in that wilderness, in that desert, and its heat and its harsh environment, it is truly a land that wearies with its hot winds and its lack of water. And David says, this is what I'm feeling, God, because I'm far from you. And he expresses that longing to God. And so this wonderful psalm gives language for us when we are feeling those days where we're kind of apart. We don't know what it is, something a bit less, and there's a growing longing in us. It's a wonderful thing to find. What would be devastating to find is if we're in some kind of wilderness space or apart or away in a unpleasant kind of mental space, that there was no longing. But this longing is good to express. And what David realizes in this area of wilderness is that when he was with God in his sanctuary, looking upon his power and his glory, experiencing his love, there was a deep satisfaction. It's like he had a great meal. But now that he's apart, he's thirsting, he's parched, he's hungering, and that is driving him to consider God and to call out to him. He does 3 things here. He thirsts for God, he remembers God, and he clings to him. And this is how he deals with his separation and his space. And he begins the psalm saying, I seek you. And this is a wonderful reaction. So maybe for you in those places where you feel that sense of being apart to something, you can go through the psalm and apply some of these things to seek the Lord. And Jesus says those wonderful words, if you seek, you will find. Isn't that a wonderful thing? That maybe to accept that times which are a little bit blare, what they do is they highlight how satisfied you were in the heights. And maybe even in this lockdown, where our normal rhythms of church and connection and fellowship and those ways that you would normally feed yourself spiritually, you've been denied them, you've been restricted from them. And there's something of a thirsting and a longing. It highlights for you just how satisfying God is and how satisfying it is to be with God's people, and then to remember the Lord, not to forget him, and then to cling to him, because he brings every season to an end. And there was a time where David was able to return to the most precious place for him, the most important place, the the place that his whole life he longed to see established, and that is to be in the presence of God, to be at the residence of God. Now we have that in Jesus Christ. He is our temple. He is the place that we meet with God. But we have those seasons that are a bit iffy. But may this psalm be of something of an encouragement to you as you seek the Lord, as you learn how to deal with those times, that you might be sitting in a wilderness of hot winds and dryness, where there are jackals and whatever, but God will bring us back to him. Seek him, long for him, remember how satisfying he is, remember him and cling to him, and may God bless you. We'll see you next week.